The rain started just as Father Thomas closed his prayer book. I remember thinking how fitting it was, as if even the sky was mourning my husband, David. Standing there at Riverside Cemetery, surrounded by faces I'd known for decades, I felt completely alone. 35 years of marriage, and here I was, a 58-year-old widow trying to figure out how to exist without the man who had been my entire world. Elena, Father Thomas called softly, his weathered hand touching my shoulder as the last of the mourners began to disperse. Before you leave, David asked me to give you something. I turned to face him, my black dress clinging to me in the dampness. Father Thomas had married us in 1989, baptized both our children, and now he was burying my husband. His kind eyes held something I couldn't quite read as he reached into his coat pocket. "He gave this to me 6 months ago," he said, his voice barely audible over the patter of rain on the canvas, tent above David's casket. "He made me promise to wait until after the service." My heart stopped 6 months ago. That was around the time David started acting so strangely, so distant. The time when our marriage began falling apart in ways I still couldn't understand. Father Thomas placed a sealed envelope in my trembling hands. My name was written across the front in David's familiar handwriting, but something about the careful, deliberate strokes looked different, desperate almost. Mrs. Martinez, my daughter Sarah, peered at my elbow. Her mascara streaked despite the waterproof promises on the tube. "Mom, we should get you home. You're soaking wet." But I couldn't move. I stared at that envelope like it might explode in my hands. David had planned this moment. While I was cooking his favorite meals and trying desperately to reconnect with my increasingly cold husband, he was writing me a letter and giving it to our priest. While I was lying awake at night wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering why the man I loved had suddenly started treating me like a stranger in my own home, he was orchestrating this moment. What does it say? Michael, my 29-year-old son, had joined us under the tent. His tie was crooked, and he kept running his hands through his hair the way he'd done as a nervous child. "I haven't opened it yet," I whispered, my voice catching. The truth was, I was terrified. The last 6 months of David's life had been a nightmare of confusion and heartbreak. My loving, attentive husband had become secretive, sometimes cruel, pulling away from me in ways that made me question everything about our relationship. There were mysterious phone calls, late nights at the office that his secretary couldn't account for, and a coldness in his eyes that I'd never seen before. I'd started to believe my husband was having an affair, that maybe he'd fallen out of love with me and was planning to leave. His sudden heart attack at 58 had robbed me of the confrontation I'd been building courage for, leaving me with nothing but questions and a grief so complicated I didn't know how to mourn him properly. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "maybe we should go home. You can read it when you're ready." I looked up at Father Thomas, searching his face for clues. Did he say anything else? The old priest's eyes filled with tears. "He said you might hate him at first, but he hoped you'd understand eventually. He said to tell you that everything he did was because he loved you too much to burden you." Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Standing there in the rain, clutching that letter, I had no idea that my entire understanding of my marriage, my husband, and the last painful months of our life together was about to be turned completely upside down. I thought I knew David Martinez. I thought I knew what kind of man I'd been married to for 35 years. But that letter would reveal a truth so devastating and so heartbreaking that it would change not just how I remembered my husband, but how I understood love itself. To understand how devastating that letter would be, you need to know what David and I had built together. For 35 years, we were the couple everyone envied. We met in 1988 at a company barbecue where I worked as a receptionist, and he was the charming insurance adjuster who made me laugh until my sides hurt. He proposed on our second anniversary at the same park where we had our first picnic, and I said yes before he even finished asking. Our life fell into the most beautiful rhythm. Every morning at 6:30, I'd wake up to David already showered and dressed, sitting on the edge of our bed, putting on his shoes. "Morning beautiful," he'd say, kissing my forehead before I was even fully awake. I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my robe and pack his lunch. Always a turkey sandwich with mustard, never mayo, because he said it made the bread soggy, an apple, and those little chocolate chip cookies from the bakery section that he pretended he didn't want, but always ate first. "You don't have to do this every day," he'd tell me. But we both knew I'd never stop. It was our routine, our small act of love that started each day. David would leave for Martinez Insurance. Yes, he'd eventually bought the company from old Mr. Peterson with a "love you, I'll see you tonight." He never missed saying it. Not once in 35 years. And he always meant it. I could see it in the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at me, even after all those years together. Our home on Maple Street was David's pride and joy. He'd spend Saturdays mowing the lawn in perfectly straight lines, then sit on our front porch with a beer, admiring his work. "Look at that grass, Elena. Thick as carpet." I'd bring him lemonade and sit beside him on the swing he'd built, watching neighbors walk their dogs and kids ride bikes. These were the moments I treasured most. Just us, no agenda, completely content in our little corner of suburban Ohio. Sunday dinners at David's mother, Ruth's house, were sacred. Every week, without fail, I'd spend Saturday afternoon making David's favorite pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe Ruth had taught me when David and I first got engaged. The secret, Ruth had whispered conspiratorially, is the packet of onion soup mix. Don't tell anyone. At those dinners, David would always brag about something I'd done that week. "Elena organized the entire church fundraiser," he'd announce proudly. "Raised $3,000 for the food bank." Or, "You should see how Elena has the neighbor kids reading to her every afternoon. She's got them loving books." He made me feel like the most accomplished woman in the world, even though I was just being myself. Our children were our greatest success. Sarah had landed her dream job in marketing at a tech company in Seattle, and Michael was teaching 5th grade right here in town, just 20 minutes away. David would beam when people asked about them. "Sarah's got her mother's heart and my stubborn streak," he'd say. "And Michael, he's going to change the world one kid at a time." We'd started talking about retirement, about finally taking that trip to Italy we'd been planning for years. David had even begun learning basic Italian phrases on his phone. "Bonjour, beautiful," he'd say, kissing me goodbye each morning, making me giggle like a teenager. I thought we were living our happily ever after. I thought the hardest decision we faced was whether to get the blue or green throw pillows for the living room couch. I believed our biggest worry was David's slight high blood pressure and whether we should switch to a different Medicare plan. I was so wrong. While I was living in our perfect little bubble, believing we had decades more of Sunday dinners and morning kisses, David was harboring a secret that would explain everything that was about to go so terribly wrong. The first crack in our perfect world appeared on a Tuesday evening in March, 6 months before David's heart attack. I remember it so clearly because Tuesdays were our grocery shopping nights, another one of our little traditions. We'd walk the aisles of Kroger together, David pushing the cart while I checked items off my carefully organized list. But that Tuesday, David said he had to work late. Big case coming up, rain check on groceries. It was unusual, but not alarming. David occasionally had demanding clients. I went shopping alone, feeling oddly incomplete without his commentary on my coupon clipping skills and his sneaky attempts to add ice cream to the cart when he thought I wasn't looking. When I got home around 8:30, David was already there sitting at our kitchen table with his phone. The moment I walked through the door carrying grocery bags, he immediately flipped his phone face down and jumped up to help me. "How was your day, honey?" I asked, starting to unpack the groceries. "Fine, same old stuff," he said, but he kept glancing at his phone on the table like it might ring at any moment. Over the next few weeks, I noticed David's relationship with his phone had changed completely. The man who used to leave his phone charging in the kitchen overnight suddenly kept it on his nightstand. The man who used to ask me to check his texts while he was driving now guarded that phone like it contained state secrets. One evening in early April, I was bringing David his usual cup of coffee while he worked on his laptop at our dining room table. He always appreciated this little gesture. I'd learned exactly how he liked it after all these years. 2 sugars, splash of cream, and I'd warmed the mug first, so the coffee stayed hot longer. As I approached with his steaming mug, I caught a glimpse of his laptop screen. He was on some kind of messaging app one didn't recognize, and I could see he was mid-conversation with someone. The moment he sensed me behind him, his hands flew to the keyboard, and he quickly minimized the window. "Here's your coffee, sweetheart," I said, setting it down beside him. "Thanks," he replied, but he wouldn't look at me. His shoulders were tense, and he kept his hands positioned protectively over his keyboard. My curiosity got the better of me. "Working late again tonight?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Seemed like you were chatting with someone." "Just work stuff, honey," he said quickly, still not meeting my eyes. "You know how it is with clients. They want updates at all hours." But something felt off. In 35 years of marriage, David had never been secretive about his work. He'd always shared stories about difficult clients, funny claims, and office drama. I knew the names of his coworkers, had attended countless company parties, and understood his business well enough to offer advice when he asked for it. "Since when do you hide work from me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and playful. "You usually tell me everything, even the boring insurance stuff." David's response shocked me. He spun around in his chair, his face flushed with an anger I'd rarely seen directed at me. "Elena, can I have 5 minutes without you hovering over me? I'm trying to work here." The harshness in his voice hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, nearly spilling the coffee I'd so lovingly prepared. This wasn't my David. My David never snapped at me for bringing him coffee. My David thanked me for little gestures and called them his daily dose of sweetness. "I'm sorry," I stammered, feeling suddenly foolish. "I didn't mean to bother you." The moment the words left my mouth, I saw something flicker across David's face. Regret, maybe guilt. But instead of apologizing, he just turned back to his laptop and said, "It's fine. I'm just stressed about this upcoming audit at work." I retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I loaded the dishwasher. An audit. That made sense, I told myself. David always got tense during audits. But deep down, a small voice whispered that something wasn't right. The David I married would have apologized immediately for snapping at me. He would have pulled me onto his lap and explained what was bothering him. That night, as I lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside me, I tried to convince myself it was just work stress. But I couldn't shake the image of how quickly he'd hidden that screen or the defensive way he'd guarded his phone. What started as one snappy evening became a pattern that slowly chipped away at the foundation of our marriage. David began working late with increasing frequency, and each missed dinner felt like another small rejection. I'd spend my afternoons planning our meals, stopping by the butcher for his favorite thick-cut pork chops, or picking up fresh salmon because he'd mentioned craving it the week before. I'd set the table with our good plates, the blue ones his mother had given us for our 10th anniversary, and light the small candle in the center, just like we'd done for decades. But more and more often, I found myself eating alone at our dining room table, staring at David's empty chair and the untouched place sitting across from me. The food would grow cold as I waited, hoping to hear his key in the front door. By 8 o'clock, I'd finally accept he wasn't coming and put his plate in the refrigerator. Another carefully prepared meal that would likely go to waste. When I'd call his office around 6:30, his secretary, Janet, would sound confused. "Oh, Mrs. Martinez, David left around 4:30 today." I assumed he was heading home. 4:30? Where was he for those extra 3 or 4 hours? David would finally walk through our front door around 9 or 10, sometimes even later. "Sorry, Elle," he'd say, not quite meeting my eyes. "Stopped for a drink with the guys. Had to decompress after that crazy day." But which guys? In 35 years, David had never been much of a drinker, and his idea of decompressing had always been coming home to me, telling me about his day while I massaged his shoulders. Now, he was seeking comfort somewhere else with people I apparently didn't know. The worst part wasn't the missed dinners or the mysterious absences. It was watching my husband become a stranger, even when he was sitting right next to me. Our evening conversations, which used to flow for hours, shrank to painful exchanges of necessary information. "Did you pay the electric bill?" he'd ask, scrolling through his phone. "Yes, it's due the 15th, I'd reply, desperate to turn this into a real conversation. "How was your day? You seemed stressed when you left this morning." "Fine," he'd answer, not looking up from his screen. "Sarah called today. She's thinking about visiting next weekend for MHM. David, are you listening to me?" "Sorry, what?" He'd glance up briefly, but his fingers would still be moving across his phone. "Work email. What about Sarah?" I'd repeat myself, but by then, the moment was gone. The enthusiasm I'd felt about our daughter's potential visit had deflated into something mechanical and hollow. Our conversations became purely transactional. "Your mother wants us to visit Sunday. The dishwasher is making that noise again. Don't forget your dentist appointment Thursday." We sounded like roommates coordinating logistics, not like lovers who had once stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning talking about everything and nothing. The David I married used to ask about my day with genuine interest. He'd want to know about my volunteer work at the food bank, about my book club discussions, about the funny thing Mrs. Chin next door had said while we were both working in our gardens. Now, when I try to share these small moments of my life, he'd nod absently while typing on his phone, and I knew he hadn't heard a word. I started to feel invisible in my own home. I'd walk into a room where David was sitting, and he wouldn't look up. I'd speak, and he'd respond with distracted murmurs that made it clear his attention was elsewhere. The man who used to notice when I got a haircut or wore a new sweater now seemed oblivious to my existence unless I was directly useful to him. I told myself this was temporary. Men went through phases, didn't they? Maybe it was a midlife crisis. Maybe work really was more stressful than usual. Maybe I was being too sensitive, too needy. I convinced myself that if I just waited it out, if I continued being the loving, supportive wife I'd always been, David would come back to me. But with each passing day, each silent dinner, each conversation that felt like pulling teeth, I began to fear that my husband was already gone, even though he was still sitting right across from me. The annual Martinez Insurance Company picnic had always been one of my favorite events. For 23 years, I'd looked forward to that first Saturday in June when David's employees and their families would gather at Riverside Park for an afternoon of food, games, and camaraderie. I knew everyone's names, remembered their children's birthdays, and genuinely enjoyed being part of David's work family. This year felt different from the moment we arrived. David seemed tense, constantly checking his phone and scanning the crowd like he was looking for someone specific or trying to avoid them. When I suggested we get our traditional spot near the pavilion where we always sat, he shook his head quickly. "Let's try somewhere new this year," he said, steering me toward a table on the far edge of the picnic area. I should have trusted my instincts then, but I was still desperately trying to salvage what remained of our connection. "Whatever makes you happy, honey," I said, squeezing his arm affectionately. For the first hour, things seemed almost normal. David introduced me to a few new employees I hadn't met, and I fell into my usual role as the friendly boss's wife, asking about their families and making them feel welcome. But I noticed David kept excusing himself to get drinks, to check on the grill, to make quick work calls that took him away from our table for long stretches. During one of his absences, I spotted a group of his longtime colleagues gathered around a table near the pavilion. Mark Stevens, Janet from the office, Tom Rodriguez, and a few others I'd known for years. These were people I'd shared countless Christmas parties and retirement celebrations with. Without thinking, I walked over to join them. "Elena," Janet stood up and hugged me warmly. "We were just talking about the Henderson claim. What a nightmare that's been." I sat down in an empty chair, excited to finally have a real conversation. "Oh, David mentioned that one. The house fire, right?" "Actually," Mark said, taking a sip of his beer, "we were just asking David how that new apartment is working out for him. Must be convenient having a place downtown for those late client meetings." The words hit me like ice water. I felt my smile freeze on my face as every person at the table suddenly went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone realizes they've said something terribly wrong. "Apartment," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and far away. "What apartment?" Mark's face went white. He looked around the table desperately, as if someone might rescue him from the hole he just dug. Oh, I mean your downtown place for when you work late. His voice trailed off weakly. David doesn't have an apartment, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the uncertainty creeping into my voice. We live on Maple Street. We've lived there for 15 years. Janet shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Tom suddenly became very interested in his potato salad. The silence stretched on until it felt suffocating. Elena, David's voice came from behind me, sharp with panic. I turned to see him approaching our table, his face flushed red and his eyes darting between me and his coworkers. There you are. I was looking for you. Mark was just telling me about your apartment, I said slowly, watching David's face carefully. Your downtown apartment. David's jaw tightened. Mark's confused, he said quickly, shooting a warning look at his colleague. He's thinking of someone else. You know how these guys get their stories mixed up. But I saw the looks that passed between them. I saw Janet's pitying expression and Tom's inability to meet my eyes. I saw Mark open his mouth as if to clarify, then think better of it and close it again.
Right.
Mark stammered clearly, uncomfortable with the lie he was being asked to support. Different guy. My mistake. The humiliation was overwhelming. Not just because there was apparently an apartment I knew nothing about, but because it was clear that everyone at this table knew something about my husband's life that I didn't. These people I'd considered friends had been watching me play the devoted wife, while knowing David was living some kind of double life. I need to use the restroom, I said, standing up so quickly that my chair scraped against the concrete. I walked away on shaking legs, hearing David call my name behind me. But I couldn't turn around. I couldn't face the pity in those familiar faces, or the lies I knew would follow. In the small restroom building near the playground, I locked myself in a stall and cried until my mascara ran in black streams down my cheeks. When I finally emerged, David was waiting outside, pacing like a caged animal. But instead of explaining, instead of apologizing, he went on the attack. You embarrassed me in there, Elena, making a scene over Mark's stupid mistake. That's when I knew with devastating clarity that my marriage was already over. The David I'd married would never have let me walk away in tears. He would have followed me immediately, held me, and explained everything. This David was more concerned about his image than my heartbreak. I'd been publicly humiliated by my own husband's secrets, and somehow I was the one being blamed for it. The drive home from the company picnic was 23 minutes of suffocating silence. David gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, and I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, trying to process what had just happened. The suburban streets that usually felt like a pathway to our sanctuary now felt like a march toward an inevitable confrontation I wasn't sure I was strong enough to handle. When we pulled into our driveway, I waited for David to turn off the engine and say something, anything that might explain the apartment Mark had mentioned. Instead, he sat there for a long moment, then got out without a word and headed straight for the house. I followed him inside, my heart pounding. 35 years of marriage had taught me to read David's moods, and everything about his posture screamed that he was preparing for battle, not reconciliation. But I had to try. I had to give him a chance to explain, to help me understand what was happening to us. David, I said gently as he headed toward his home office. Can we please talk about what happened back there? He stopped in the doorway, but didn't turn around. What's there to talk about? Mark made a mistake. Honey, please look at me. My voice was barely above a whisper. I just need to understand. If there's something going on, if you're unhappy, we can work through it. We always have. That's when he spun around, and the expression on his face was one I'd never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was something colder, more calculated, like he'd been waiting for this moment and had already decided how it would go. You're being paranoid, Elena. His voice exploded through our quiet house. I can't even have a conversation with my coworkers without you creating drama. Do you hear yourself right now? I took a step back, stunned by the venom in his tone. I'm not creating drama. I just asked about you. You just embarrassed me in front of my entire staff, he continued, his voice growing louder. Mark was confused, And instead of letting it go, you had to make it into some big conspiracy theory. What's next, Elena? Are you going to start following me to work, going through my phone, hiding in the bushes? Each word felt like a physical blow. This wasn't a conversation or even an argument. This was character assassination. David was painting me as a paranoid, jealous wife instead of addressing the very real inconsistency that had triggered this whole situation. I've never done any of those things, I said, my voice shaking. I've never given you any reason to talk to me this way. All I did was ask about something that confused me. Well, maybe if you had something else to focus on besides monitoring my every move, you wouldn't be so confused all the time, he shot back. Maybe if you had your own life instead of living through mine, you'd understand that men sometimes need space to breathe. The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. I had my own life, my volunteer work, my friendships, my book club, my garden. But I had also made him and our marriage the center of my world because I thought that's what love looked like. I thought that's what he wanted. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I wasn't even sure what I was apologizing for. I didn't mean to upset you. David's anger seemed to deflate slightly, but instead of softening toward me, he just looked tired and frustrated. I can't do this right now, Elena. I need some space to think. He walked into his office and closed the door, leaving me standing alone in our hallway, feeling like I'd just been dismissed from my own marriage. That night, I lay in bed next to David. But I might as well have been sleeping next to a stranger. The space between us felt like an ocean, and I knew that something fundamental had shifted. His reaction had been so disproportionate, so defensive that it confirmed every fear I'd been trying to suppress. In the days that followed, I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid to ask questions or express concerns that might trigger another explosion. I stopped inquiring about his day, stopped mentioning when he was late, and stopped trying to engage him in the conversations that had once been the lifeblood of our relationship. I began pouring my energy into other things, spending more time at the food bank, visiting Mrs. Chun next door more frequently, and taking longer walks around the neighborhood. I threw myself into activities that made me feel useful and valued, since I clearly wasn't finding those feelings at home anymore. David seemed relieved by my withdrawal. He no longer had to deflect my questions or manufacture excuses for his behavior. We existed in the same house like polite roommates, sharing space, but no longer sharing our lives. I told myself I was giving him the space he demanded, but really I was protecting myself from further humiliation. If I didn't ask questions, I couldn't be accused of being paranoid. If I didn't reach for connection, I couldn't be rejected again. But with each day of this cold détente, I felt a little more of myself disappearing. 3 months before David's heart attack, on a gray Saturday afternoon in October, I hit the lowest point of my entire life. David had left that morning for what he called a work emergency, though it was the weekend and his office building was closed. I didn't question him anymore. I'd learned that asking only led to accusations and arguments that left me feeling smaller than before. I was alone in our house, truly alone in a way I'd never experienced, even when David was physically absent. The silence felt different that day, heavier somehow, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked through the rooms we'd lovingly decorated together, touching surfaces that used to represent our shared life, but now felt like props in a play I was no longer part of. In our bedroom, I stopped in front of our wedding photos arranged on David's dresser. There we were, young and radiant, looking at each other like we held the secrets to eternal happiness. I picked up our favorite picture, the one where David was spinning me around in my wedding dress, both of us laughing with pure joy. I stared at that version of myself, trying to remember what it felt like to be so certain of being loved, so confident in my place in someone else's world. When did I become this woman, this person who tiptoed through her own home, afraid to ask questions, afraid to express needs, afraid to take up space? When did I start apologizing for existing? I sat on our bed and tried to remember the last time David had touched me with affection. Not a perfunctory kiss goodbye or an accidental brush of hands reaching for the salt, but actual intentional contact that said, "I love you," or "I want you," or even, "I like having you near me." I couldn't recall a single instance in months. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't remember the last time my husband had said he loved me and actually looked at me while saying it. The words had become as automatic and meaningless as "please pass the butter." I found myself thinking about our old evening routine. How we used to sit together on the couch, my feet tucked under his leg while we watched television. How he'd absently stroke my hair while we talked about our day. Now David spent his evenings in his office with the door closed or on his phone in the living room, but never with me. Never focused on me. The grief was overwhelming, not just for what I was losing, but for what I'd already lost without even realizing it. I was mourning my marriage while my husband was still alive, still living in the same house, still sharing the same last name. How do you grieve someone who's standing right in front of you, but has already gone away? That evening, when I could no longer bear the suffocating silence of our house, I called my best friend, Carol. The moment I heard her voice, I broke down completely. "I think my marriage is over," I sobbed into the phone. "But I don't know how to leave after 35 years. I don't even know who I am without him. I've been Elena Martinez for so long that I can't remember who Elena was before that. What if there's nothing left of me?" Carol didn't try to offer solutions or advice. She just listened as I cried 3 months' worth of suppressed tears. As I finally admitted what I'd been too proud or too scared to say out loud, I was desperately unhappy and completely lost. "I feel like I'm disappearing," I whispered. "Like I'm becoming invisible, even to myself." It was after midnight when Carol found me sitting in my car in our driveway, unable to face going back inside. I'd been there for almost 2 hours, staring at our house. The house where David and I had made love, raised children, celebrated anniversaries, and planned our future. Now it looked like a stranger's home, like a place I was visiting but didn't belong. "Elena, honey, you're scaring me," Carol said, sliding into the passenger seat. "What are you doing out here?" "I don't know how to go back in there," I admitted. "I don't know how to pretend everything is okay for one more day. I don't know how to keep being married to someone who doesn't want me." Carol took my hand in hers. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight, but you can't sit in this car forever." "Why not?" I asked, and I genuinely meant it. "At least out here, I don't have to pretend I don't notice that my husband is living a completely separate life. At least out here, I can admit that I'm scared and confused, and I don't understand what happened to us." That night was the first time I truly considered that my marriage might not survive. And the thought terrified me almost as much as the thought of continuing to live this way did. 2 weeks after David's funeral, I finally worked up the courage to begin the heartbreaking task of going through his belongings. Sarah and Michael had offered to help, but I'd insisted on doing it alone. I needed this private time to say goodbye to the physical remnants of our life together, even if that life had become something I no longer recognized in his final months. I started with his dresser, the heavy oak piece his father had built in 1962. David had always been meticulous about his clothing, everything folded precisely, shirts arranged by color, ties rolled and stored in the small wooden box I'd given him for our 5th anniversary. As I worked through each drawer, I found myself touching his sweaters, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered on his clothes. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath his winter sweaters, my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong, an envelope with my name written in David's careful handwriting. But this wasn't the letter Father Thomas had given me at the funeral. This was different paper, older, and it was sealed with tape that had yellowed slightly around the edges. My heart started racing as I pulled it out. The envelope was thick, heavier than a simple note, and I could feel there were multiple pages inside. Across the front, in David's unmistakable script, was written, "Elena, if something happens to me, please read this first before the letter I gave Father Thomas. I love you more than you'll ever know. David." I sank onto our bedroom floor, still holding the envelope, my mind reeling. 2 letters. How long had David been planning for his death? How long had he been keeping secrets that required written explanations? With trembling fingers, I tore open the envelope. Inside were 4 handwritten pages in David's careful script, along with several folded documents I couldn't immediately identify. I unfolded the first page and began to read. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found this letter in our dresser drawer, just as I always hoped you would. I need you to know that everything I'm about to tell you comes from a place of love, even though I know it will hurt you terribly. I had to stop reading and catch my breath. The words were so similar to what he'd written in the letter Father Thomas had given me, but there was something different about the tone, more urgent, more desperate. 8 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Harrison confirmed what I had been terrified to acknowledge. The memory lapses, the confusion, the moments when I couldn't remember simple things were not just stress or getting older. They were the beginning of the same disease that took my father's mind piece by piece until he didn't even recognize my mother anymore. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Alzheimer's. David had Alzheimer's. The paper shook in my hands as I tried to process what I was reading. Elena, I watched what this disease did to my family. I watched my mother become a caregiver, a nurse, a stranger to her own husband. I watched her cry in the kitchen when she thought no one could see, mourning the man who was still sitting in the living room but was no longer really there. I couldn't bear the thought of putting you through that same hell. I thought about David's father, Frank, who had died 5 years ago after a long, brutal decline. I remembered how David had struggled watching his vibrant, intelligent father become confused and frightened. How he'd said repeatedly, "I never want Mom to go through this, and I'd rather die first than put someone I love through what she's enduring." The apartment Mark mentioned at the picnic, it was real, Elena, but it wasn't what you thought. It wasn't another woman or another life I was hiding from you. It was a place I was planning to go when the disease progressed, when I became too much of a burden for you to handle. I was trying to make arrangements so that when the time came, you wouldn't have to make the terrible choice between caring for me and preserving your own life. My sobs were coming so hard now that I could barely continue reading, but I forced myself to keep going. I know my behavior these past months has been inexcusable. I know I've been cruel, distant, and cold. Every day I pulled away from you was another day I was trying to protect you from the pain that was coming. I thought if I made you love me less, if I made our separation feel inevitable, it would be easier for you when I had to leave. The letter continued, but I had to set it down. Everything made sense now. The secrecy, the anger, the mysterious absences. David hadn't been having an affair or planning to abandon me. He'd been planning to abandon himself to protect me from a future he couldn't bear to put me through. I spent 3 days in our bedroom reading and rereading David's letter until I had memorized every word. The documents he'd included painted a picture of a man desperately trying to orchestrate his own disappearance while believing he was performing the ultimate act of love. There were apartment lease papers dated 6 months ago, contact information for a specialized care facility in Columbus, and even a drafted letter to our children explaining why Daddy had to go away. For 72 hours, I didn't shower, barely ate, and ignored the concerned calls from Sarah, Michael, and Carol. I needed this time to let the truth settle into my bones, to understand how completely I had misinterpreted everything about the last 8 months of my marriage. The anger hit me first, raw, consuming fury at David for making decisions about our life without including me. How dare he decide what I could and couldn't handle? How dare he assume I would abandon him when he needed me most? I threw his pillow across the room and screamed at his photograph on the nightstand. "You coward! You selfish, arrogant coward! You robbed us both." But then the anger gave way to something deeper and more complicated. Grief for what we'd lost. Not just when he died, but in those months when we were both suffering alone. David had been carrying the terror of his diagnosis in isolation, probably lying awake at night planning his exit strategy while I lay beside him, wondering why he didn't love me anymore. I began to see our final months together through his eyes. When he snapped at me for bringing him coffee, he wasn't rejecting my care. He was panicking about becoming dependent on it. When he avoided my questions about his day, he wasn't hiding an affair. He was hiding doctor's appointments and research about memory care facilities. When he came home late, he wasn't meeting another woman. He was sitting in that downtown apartment, probably crying and trying to figure out how to vanish from my life without destroying me. The cruelest irony was that his plan had backfired completely. Instead of protecting me from pain, His withdrawal had caused me months of agony. Instead of making me love him less, his coldness had made me question my own worth. Instead of preparing me for life without him, his behavior had left me feeling like I'd failed as a wife. On the fourth day, I finally called Dr. Harrison's office. I needed to hear the truth from someone who had been there, who had witnessed David's fear firsthand. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Harrison said gently when he returned my call, "I'm so sorry for your loss. David was a remarkable man who loved you very much. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 8 months ago," I said without preamble. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" There was a long pause. "Your husband was adamant about maintaining his privacy. He was terrified of what the diagnosis meant for your future together." "What exactly did he say to you about me?" "He kept asking about progression timelines. How quickly would he decline? Would there be a point where he wouldn't recognize you? He wanted to know about every stage, every possible symptom, and then he'd ask the same question every visit. How do I spare my family from watching me disappear?" I closed my eyes, picturing David in that sterile office, receiving news that shattered his world while already planning to carry the burden alone. "I encouraged him many times to tell you," Dr. Harrison continued. "I explained that families do better when they face these challenges together. But he said he'd seen what the disease did to his father and his mother, and he couldn't put you through that. So, he put me through something else instead," I said quietly. "Yes," Dr. Harrison agreed. "He thought he was choosing the lesser of two evils. He was wrong, but his intentions came from love." That evening, I sat in our backyard, where David had spent countless hours working in his vegetable garden. The tomato plants he'd nurtured last summer were now brown and lifeless. But I could still see evidence of his careful planning. The neat rows, the sturdy stakes, the way he'd positioned everything to get maximum sunlight. David had always been a planner, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He approached his illness the same way he approached everything else in his life, with meticulous preparation and the absolute conviction that he could control the outcome through sheer force of will. For the first time since his death, I felt something other than confusion or anger. I felt profound sadness for the man who had been so terrified of burdening the people he loved that he'd chosen to break our hearts instead. I understood now that every cruel word, every cold shoulder, every moment of rejection had been his misguided attempt to set us free. David had been wrong about so many things, but he hadn't been wrong about loving me. He loved me enough to sacrifice our happiness in service of what he believed was my future well-being. It was the most devastating gift anyone had ever tried to give me. Understanding David's motives didn't erase the pain he'd caused, but it gave me a roadmap for healing that I hadn't had before. I couldn't bring him back to have the conversations we should have had, but I could honor both his love and my own need for truth by learning everything I could about what he'd been facing. I started small, researching Alzheimer's disease in the privacy of my home office. I read medical journals, patient testimonials, and caregiver resources, trying to understand the progression David had been so terrified of. The early symptoms described in the literature matched things I now realized I'd witnessed but dismissed. His occasional confusion about dates, the way he'd sometimes struggled to find familiar words, the increasing difficulty he'd had with complex tasks at work. One afternoon, while reading about early-stage Alzheimer's symptoms, I came across an article about something called catastrophic thinking, the tendency for newly diagnosed patients to imagine the worst-case scenarios and plan their lives around avoiding them. The description fit David perfectly, a man who'd watched his father's decline and convinced himself that the same fate was inevitable and imminent. I began attending online support groups for families affected by Alzheimer's. Not yet ready to share my story, but desperate to hear from others who understood what David had been going through. I logged in as Elena M. and listened to spouses, children, and patients themselves describe the fear, the planning, the desperate attempts to control an uncontrollable future. One evening, a woman named Patricia shared her husband's story. He was diagnosed at 59, and for 6 months, he tried to handle everything alone. He became mean, distant, and started making cruel comments about how I deserved better than taking care of a broken man. It wasn't until our son found his notebook, pages and pages of plans for how to disappear from our lives, that we understood he was trying to sacrifice our present happiness to protect us from a future that might never come. I sat in my kitchen crying as I listened to this stranger describe my exact situation. David wasn't unique in his misguided attempt at protection. There were others like him, men and women so terrified of becoming burdens that they'd chosen to break their families' hearts instead. During this time, I also began the practical work of understanding David's secret preparations. I found receipts for the downtown apartment hidden in his desk drawer, along with printed emails from care facilities and research about long-term care insurance policies he'd purchased without telling me. Every document revealed another layer of his planning, another way he'd been trying to shield me from a future he couldn't bear to imagine putting me through. The most heartbreaking discovery was a notebook he'd kept, documenting his symptoms and their frequency. Forgot Sarah's birthday yesterday. Had to ask Elena when it was. Couldn't remember the password for the office computer. Third time this month. Got lost driving to the hardware store on Miller Road. Have driven that route hundreds of times. He'd been tracking his own decline with the same meticulous attention he'd brought to everything else in his life, probably watching for signs that it was time to execute his disappearance plan. I made an appointment with a grief counselor who specialized in complicated loss. I needed help processing the conflicting emotions I was experiencing. Love and anger, gratitude and resentment, understanding and heartbreak all swirled together in ways that made it impossible to grieve cleanly. What David did to you was a form of emotional abuse, my counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, explained during our first session. It doesn't matter that his intentions were loving. The impact was devastating. You're allowed to be angry about that while also understanding his fear. She helped me see that I could hold two truths simultaneously. David had acted out of love, and David had caused me tremendous pain. Both could be true without negating the other. I also began reaching out to my own support system in new ways. I called Sarah and Michael and asked them to come for dinner, not to help me sort through their father's things, but to help me understand if they'd noticed the changes I'd missed. Mom, Michael said quietly over my homemade lasagna. Dad called me about 6 months ago, asking weird questions like, would I promise to take care of you if something happened to him? Would I make sure you weren't alone? I thought he was just being morbid. But now Sarah nodded. He asked me similar things, and he kept asking about your friends, whether you had people you could count on. I thought it was sweet that he worried about you, but it was kind of intense. These conversations helped me piece together a timeline of David's planning. He hadn't just been preparing for his own exit. He'd been quietly ensuring that I would have a support network in place when he was gone. Even in his misguided attempt to protect me, he'd been thinking about my well-being after his departure. 6 weeks after David's funeral, armed with knowledge and a growing understanding of what had really happened in our marriage, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of my own worth returning. The grief counseling sessions with Dr. Chen had helped me separate David's fear from my own value as a person. His need to protect me from his illness didn't mean I was fragile or incapable. It meant he was terrified and operating from a place of trauma. The first sign that my perspective was changing came during a conversation with our longtime neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. She stopped by with a casserole, the 4th one since the funeral, and settled into our kitchen for what I expected would be another well-meaning but painful conversation about how I was holding up. Elena, I have to tell you something, she said, stirring her coffee nervously. The last few months before David passed, I was worried about you. You seemed so diminished, like you were walking on eggshells in your own home. I almost said something several times, but I didn't want to interfere. Instead of the shame I would have felt weeks earlier, I found myself nodding calmly. You weren't wrong, Maria. Things were very difficult between us toward the end. I couldn't understand it, she continued. David had always been so attentive to you, so proud of you. But lately when I'd see you two together in the yard or at the mailbox, there was this distance, like you were strangers. We were strangers, I said quietly. David was keeping a secret that changed everything about how he saw our future. And rather than trust me with that information, he decided to push me away to protect me from it. Maria's eyes widened. A secret. I found myself able to share the basic truth without falling apart. David was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 8 months ago. He never told me. Instead, he tried to make our marriage so cold and distant that when he eventually left for a care facility, I wouldn't miss him as much. "Oh, Elena," Maria breathed. "That explains so much. But how could he think you wouldn't want to face that together?" That question, how could he think that, had become my touchstone. It reminded me that David's decision wasn't a reflection of my capabilities or strength. It was a reflection of his own fear and his memory of watching his mother struggle with his father's decline. I started making different choices in my daily life. When Sarah called, instead of pretending I was fine, I began sharing real updates about my emotional state. "I'm angry at your father today," I might say. "I'm learning that I can love him and be furious with him at the same time." When Michael visited, instead of hiding the evidence of my research into Alzheimer's, I left the books and printed articles on the coffee table. "I'm trying to understand what Dad was so afraid of," I explained when I caught him reading over the materials. "I think it helps to know what enemy he thought he was fighting." The most significant shift happened when David's business partner, Jem, called to check on me. We'd known each other for 15 years, but the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be offended," Jim said. Those last few months, David seemed different, more irritable, less focused. I was starting to worry about the business. "Did he seem okay to you at home?" Before David's diagnosis revelation, I would have covered for him, made excuses, protected his reputation, even at the cost of my own truth. But now, I felt a quiet strength in my response. "No, Jim, he wasn't okay. He was hiding a medical diagnosis that terrified him. And rather than get support, he tried to handle it alone. It affected everything: our marriage, his work, his relationships with the kids. He was suffering, but he made choices that caused everyone around him to suffer, too." Jim was quiet for a long moment. I wish he'd felt he could talk to someone. We might have been able to help. "David didn't want help," I said. And for the first time, I said it without making excuses for him. He wanted control. He thought he could manage his illness, our marriage, and our family's future through sheer force of will and secrecy. He was wrong. That conversation marked a turning point. I wasn't defending David's choices anymore, but I wasn't demonizing him either. I was simply telling the truth about what had happened, allowing the complexity of the situation to exist without trying to make it simpler or more palatable for others. I began to understand that David's power over me had come from my confusion about his behavior. Once I understood his motivations, his actions lost their ability to make me question my own worth. He had been cruel to me, but his cruelty hadn't been a judgment of my value. It had been a symptom of his terror. 2 months after David's death, I made the decision to visit Dr. Harrison in person. I needed to hear the complete truth about David's diagnosis and treatment, not just the fragments I'd pieced together from letters and research. I also needed to understand if there had been opportunities for intervention that we'd missed because of David's secrecy. Dr. Harrison's office was exactly what I'd expected: diplomas on wood-paneled walls, medical journals stacked on his desk, the faint smell of antiseptic that reminded me of David's increasingly frequent dentist appointments that now made perfect sense. When Dr. Harrison entered the room, his expression was kind but guarded. "Mrs. Martinez, thank you for coming in. I've been hoping we'd have this conversation." I placed David's letters on his desk, both the one from Father Thomas and the one I'd found in his dresser. I need to understand exactly what my husband was going through, and I need to know if his fears were justified. Dr. Harrison read through the letters carefully, occasionally nodding or sighing softly. When he finished, he looked up at me with genuine compassion. "Your husband was terrified, Elena. May I call you Elena?" When I nodded, he continued, "In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen a patient so consumed by fear of his diagnosis." David wasn't just worried about forgetting things or needing care. He was convinced that Alzheimer's would turn him into a burden that would destroy your life. But was he right to be so afraid? I asked directly. Was his condition progressing rapidly? Did he have reason to believe he was facing immediate decline? Dr. Harrison shook his head slowly. That's what makes this so tragic. David's test results showed very early stage changes. His cognitive assessments were still largely normal. We were talking about a progression timeline that could span many years, possibly decades, especially with early intervention and medication. The weight of that statement hit me like a physical blow. You're telling me he destroyed our marriage based on a fear of something that might not have happened for years? Elena, I told David repeatedly that early diagnosis was actually a gift. It meant we could plan together, try medications that might slow progression, and ensure that you both had years of quality time ahead. But he kept asking about worst-case scenarios. What if I decline rapidly like my father? What if I become violent or aggressive? What if I don't recognize Elena? He was fixated on possibilities rather than probabilities. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced since finding the letters. Did you ever suggest he tell me? Did you encourage him to include me in his care? Every single visit, Dr. Harrison said firmly. I explained that family support improves outcomes, that isolation and stress can actually accelerate cognitive decline. I even offered to have you come in together, so I could explain the diagnosis and answer both your questions. What did he say to that? Dr. Harrison pulled out David's file and flipped through several pages. I documented his exact words after I suggested including you in his care. Doctor, you don't understand. Elena has already sacrificed 35 years of her life taking care of me and our family. I won't ask her to sacrifice whatever years she has left watching me disappear. She deserves to be free to live her own life. I stared at Dr. Harrison, feeling the full impact of David's misguided nobility. He thought loving someone meant protecting them from the opportunity to love you back. That's exactly right, Dr. Harrison agreed. David saw love as a one-way transaction. He couldn't conceive that you might want to face this challenge together, that you might find meaning and connection even in difficult circumstances. I took a deep breath, feeling pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. What about the apartment, this secret planning? David asked me about when patients typically need residential care. I explained that many people with early-stage Alzheimer's live at home for years with support, but he kept pressing for worst-case timelines. When would he need to be in a facility? When would he become dangerous to himself or others? He was planning for certainties that simply didn't exist. The room fell quiet as I processed this information. David had essentially ended our marriage based on fears of a future that might never have come to pass. He'd caused us months of pain to avoid years of challenges that we could have faced together. Dr. Harrison, I said finally, I need you to understand something. David's decision to handle this alone didn't protect me from suffering. It just changed the kind of suffering I experienced. Instead of facing a disease together, I spent months thinking my husband had stopped loving me. Instead of feeling useful and needed, I felt worthless and rejected. His protection felt like abandonment. Dr. Harrison nodded sadly. I tried to explain that to him. Elena, I told him that secrecy and emotional withdrawal could be more damaging than any diagnosis, but he was convinced he was sparing you pain, not causing it. As I left Dr. Harrison's office that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before David's diagnosis revelation: righteous anger. Not the confused, self-doubting anger I'd felt when I thought he might be having an affair, but clear, justified anger at a man who had made unilateral decisions about our life based on his own fears rather than our shared reality. David had been wrong, not just misguided or overly protective, but fundamentally wrong about what love looked like, what I was capable of handling, and what our marriage could have endured together. 3 days after my confrontation with Dr. Harrison, I was in David's home office, sorting through the last of his papers, when I discovered something that changed everything I thought I understood about his final months. Hidden behind a row of insurance manuals, I found a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn as if it had been handled frequently. And when I opened it, I immediately recognized David's handwriting filling page after page. The first entry was dated exactly 8 months ago, the day of his diagnosis. March 15th, Dr. Harrison confirmed what I've been afraid to acknowledge: early-stage Alzheimer's. I keep thinking about Dad, about how he forgot Mom's name, forgot he loved her, forgot everything that made him who he was. I can't do that to Elena. I won't. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, but I forced myself to keep reading. March 22nd. Elena made my favorite breakfast this morning, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup. She was humming while she cooked, completely happy, completely trusting that our life together would continue exactly as it has for 35 years. How do I tell her that everything is about to change? How do I steal that peace from her? Page after page, David had documented not just his symptoms and fears, but his love for me. Every cruel interaction he'd written about with devastating honesty, but from a perspective I'd never imagined. April 3rd. Elena brought me coffee tonight while I was working. The way she warmed the mug first, added exactly the right amount of cream, smiled when she sat it down next to me. 35 years of knowing exactly how to take care of me. I snapped at her when she asked about my work. I watched her face crumble, watched her retreat to the kitchen, and I hated myself. But if I let her keep taking care of me, she'll never be able to stop. She'll spend the rest of her life as my caregiver instead of my wife. I had to stop reading. The coffee incident that had hurt me so deeply, David had suffered through it, too. Had tormented himself with guilt while believing he was protecting me. April 18th. Elena tried to talk to me about our day today, like she has every day for decades. I gave her one-word answers while staring at my phone. I saw the confusion in her eyes, the way she's starting to doubt herself. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. But if I can make her stop loving me gradually, it won't destroy her when I have to leave. The entries continued through the spring and summer, each one revealing the internal battle David had been fighting. He documented every time I tried to connect with him, every conversation I attempted, every loving gesture I made, and his own agonizing responses. June 2nd. Company picnic today. Elena was so excited to see everyone, to be the supportive wife she's always been. When Mark mentioned the apartment, I watched 35 years of trust die in her eyes. I made her doubt reality itself. I'm becoming exactly the kind of man I swore I'd never be. The kind who hurts the person he loves most. But the alternative is watching her waste away taking care of me for the next decade. But it was the final entries that broke my heart completely. September 10th. Elena has stopped asking about my day. She stopped trying to engage me in conversation. She stopped reaching for my hand when we watch TV. My plan is working. She's pulling away from me. So, why does it feel like I'm dying while I'm still alive? I wanted to protect her from watching me disappear, but instead I've made myself disappear while I'm still here. September 18th. I heard Elena crying on the phone with Carol tonight. She thinks our marriage is over. She thinks I don't love her anymore. She's questioning her own worth because of how I've been treating her. This isn't protection. This is cruelty. I need to find a way to tell her the truth, but I'm terrified it's too late. How do you explain that every unkind word was meant as kindness? How do you ask forgiveness for breaking someone's heart to save it? The last entry was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack, October 15th. I wrote Elena a letter today explaining everything. I gave it to Father Thomas with instructions to give it to her after my funeral. I also wrote another letter and hid it in our dresser drawer in case something happens before I can find the courage to tell her myself. I don't know if she'll ever forgive me, but I need her to know that every day I pulled away from her was another day I loved her too much to burden her with my future. I closed the journal and sat in David's chair, surrounded by the evidence of a man who had loved me so fiercely that he'd been willing to destroy our present to protect my future. The journal revealed what the letters had only hinted at. David hadn't just been afraid of becoming a burden. He'd been tormented by every moment of pain he'd caused me while believing it was necessary. This wasn't just misguided protection. This was a man who had suffered alongside me through every cruel interaction, who had documented his own heartbreak at pushing away the person he loved most in the world. David had been as much a victim of his fear as I had been, trapped in a plan that was destroying us both, but too terrified of the alternative to change course. For the first time since his death, I felt the possibility of forgiveness beginning to take root alongside my anger. Not forgiveness that excused his choices, but forgiveness that acknowledged the impossible position fear had put him in. For months after David's death, I was sitting in my kitchen reading his journal for what must have been the 20th time when I heard a tentative knock at my front door. Through the window, I could see Ruth, David's 82-year-old mother, standing on my porch with a covered dish in her hands and uncertainty written across her face. Ruth and I had maintained a polite but distant relationship since the funeral. She'd been David's fierce protector his entire life, and I'd sensed her quiet disapproval of what she perceived as my failure to make her son happy in his final months. I'd been too raw and confused to attempt explanations, and she'd been too proud to ask direct questions. "Elena, dear," Ruth said when I opened the door. "I brought you some of that chicken and rice casserole you always liked. I thought maybe we could talk." I invited her in, settling her at the kitchen table where she'd sat for countless Sunday dinners. But this time felt different. Tentative, careful, like we were both walking on fragile ground. "Ruth, before you say anything, I need you to know something about David's final months," I began, placing his letters and journal on the table between us. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what was happening in our marriage." Ruth's hands fluttered nervously over her purse strap. "Elena, I owe you an enormous apology. I've been carrying guilt for months now, and I need to tell you something before you explain anything to me." I waited as she gathered her courage. "I noticed changes in David starting last spring," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He seemed distracted during our Sunday visits. Sometimes forgot things we just discussed. When I asked him about it, he'd brush me off, say he was just tired from work stress. But a mother knows, Elena, a mother knows when something's wrong with her child." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "The last few months, when he'd bring you to dinner, I could see the distance between you two. You looked diminished somehow, sad, and David seemed angry all the time, short-tempered in ways he'd never been. I thought," she paused, struggling with the admission, "I thought you were having marriage problems, and I blamed you for making my son unhappy." I reached across the table and took her weathered hand in mine. "Ruth, David was sick. He was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 8 months before he died. And he never told anyone. Not me, not you, not the kids. He was so afraid of becoming a burden that he decided to push everyone away instead." Ruth's face went completely white. "Alzheimer's like his father?" "Exactly like his father. That's what terrified him." I opened David's journal to one of the entries that mentioned her. "Listen to this. I watched what Dad's illness did to Mom. How she aged 10 years and 5. How she lost herself in taking care of someone who no longer knew her name. I can't do that to Elena. I won't." Ruth began to cry, her shoulders shaking with the weight of understanding. "Oh, my poor boy. He was so scared when his father got sick. He used to say he'd rather die young than put someone through what I went through. He tried to make me stop loving him." I continued gently. "He thought if he was cruel enough, cold enough, I'd be relieved when he eventually had to go to a care facility. He was trying to save me from years of caregiving by destroying our marriage instead. And I made it worse," Ruth sobbed. "I was cold to you at the funeral, disappointed in you for not being there for him. I thought you'd given up on him when he needed you most. But you didn't even know he was sick." "Neither of us knew," I said firmly. "David made sure of that. He was so convinced he was protecting us that he couldn't see he was hurting us instead." Ruth wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "Elena, I need you to forgive an old woman's assumptions. I've been angry at you for months, thinking you'd failed my son, but you were as much in the dark as I was. There's nothing to forgive, Ruth. We were both trying to make sense of David's behavior without knowing what was really driving it." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Ruth spoke again. "What do we do now? How do we grieve for someone who is trying to love us, but hurt us instead?" "I think we remember that David was human," I said slowly. "He made terrible choices out of fear, but his intentions came from love. We can be angry about his methods while still honoring his heart." Ruth nodded, looking older, but somehow more peaceful than when she'd arrived. "Could you share more of what David wrote? I'd like to understand what my son was going through, even if it's difficult to hear." For the next 2 hours, I read Ruth's selections from David's journal, watching her face as she recognized the son she'd raised. Thoughtful, protective, sometimes stubborn to a fault. By the time she left, we'd begun to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of shared understanding rather than shared blame. "Elena," Ruth said as I walked her to her car. "David was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about one thing. You are strong enough to handle anything. I see that now." That evening, I realized that Ruth's visit had given me something I didn't know I needed: confirmation that David's behavior had been noticeable to others, that I hadn't imagined the distance between us, and that his mother, the person who knew him longest, could see the love behind his misguided choices without excusing them. For the first time since his death, I felt like I wasn't carrying the burden of understanding David's complexity alone. 1 year after David's death, I stand in our bedroom on a quiet Sunday morning, holding his journal and the 2 letters that changed everything I thought I knew about love and loss. Outside, the maple tree David planted for our 20th anniversary is turning brilliant shades of red and gold, just as it has every October since he put it in the ground with such hope for our future. I've moved his photograph from the nightstand to the dresser, a small change that signals how I've learned to live with his memory rather than being haunted by it. Sometimes I still talk to him, but now my words carry both love and anger, understanding and disappointment, the full complexity of what we shared. "You broke my heart twice, David," I say to his smiling face in our wedding photo. "Once when you pulled away from me, and once when I learned why. But I understand now what you were trying to do, even though you were so terribly wrong about how to do it." The past year has been a journey of unraveling and rebuilding everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Through grief counseling, through sharing David's story with others, and through countless conversations with Sarah, Michael, and Ruth, I've come to understand that love isn't always wise, and protection isn't always protective. David loved me enough to sacrifice our happiness for what he believed was my future well-being. It was the most devastating gift anyone has ever tried to give me. The gift of freedom from a burden I never would have considered a burden. The gift of peace at the cost of our peace together. I've joined an Alzheimer's advocacy group, something I never imagined doing. Twice a month, I sit in a circle with newly diagnosed patients and their families, sharing David's story as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope. I tell them about the months we lost to secrecy and fear, and I help them understand that facing an uncertain future together is always better than facing it alone. Just last week, a man named Robert, recently diagnosed at 62, broke down crying as I read portions of David's journal. "That's exactly what I've been thinking," he whispered. "That I need to push my wife away before I become too much for her to handle." His wife, Margaret, took his hand and said firmly, "But I'm sitting right here, Robert. I'm sitting right here, and I'm not going anywhere. Don't you dare take away my choice to love you through this." Watching that moment, I felt both heartbreak for what David and I never got to have and gratitude for the conversations I'm now able to facilitate. David's fear has become my purpose, helping other couples have the conversations we never got to have. I've learned that the cruelest thing someone can do to you sometimes comes from their deepest love. David tried to save me from grief, but grief found me anyway, just in a different form. Instead of grieving his illness together, I grieved the loss of his love alone. Instead of feeling useful and needed as his partner in facing challenges, I felt worthless and rejected as the woman he no longer wanted. The irony is that David's attempt to protect me from becoming a caregiver turned me into exactly what he feared: a woman diminished by the weight of caring for someone who couldn't receive that care. I became a caregiver to a marriage that was dying, to a husband who was disappearing emotionally while still physically present. Now I understand that love isn't about protection from pain. It's about choosing to face that pain together. It's about trusting your partner with the truth, even when that truth is frightening. It's about believing that the person you've chosen to spend your life with is strong enough to walk beside you through whatever comes, rather than assuming they need to be shielded from your reality. David thought love meant sparing me from difficulty. But real love would have meant trusting me with that difficulty, respecting my choice to stand by him, and believing in our ability to face the unknown together. I still miss him every day. Not just the David I lost when he died, but the David I lost 8 months before that when fear convinced him to stop being my partner and start being my protector instead. I miss the conversations we never had about his diagnosis, the plans we never made together, the goodbye we never got to say with full honesty between us. But I'm no longer angry at him. I understand now that David was as much a prisoner of his fear as I was a victim of his protection. He was a good man who made terrible choices while believing he was making loving ones. As I place his journal back in the dresser drawer where I found it, I think about the couple I met with yesterday, recently married, both 34, facing his early onset diagnosis together. They hold hands as they ask questions, finish each other's sentences, and plan for their future with both hope and realism. That's what David and I should have had. But his gift to me now is the ability to help others avoid the mistakes we made. To show them that love is not about protection from pain, but about the courage to share that pain so neither person has to carry it alone. David tried to write the ending to our story by himself. Now I'm helping other couples write their stories together.